As we saw in the last video, and will continue to explore in this one, the ongoing Russian offensives are not going according to plan. However, that does not mean that there's an absence of widespread destruction and suffering. In fact, Russia's frustration has seemingly only amplified the destructive nature of the conflict. Currently, much of that destructive capacity is concentrated on the city of Mariupol. This city has long been the focus of Russian campaigns on the Sea of Azov. Back in 2014, it was briefly seized by the Donetsk separatists and their Russian backers. However, Ukraine regained control of the city with some assistance from some controversial militia groups, such as the Azov Battalion. They were able to push out Russia's own proxy militia groups, and Mariupol has since then remained a key Ukrainian stronghold on the Sea of Azov, not only because it's the 100th largest city in Europe and a major port, but also because the city of nearly 500,000 people has spent the last 8 years essentially right on the front line, while also stymieing Russia's desire to connect the Donbass to Crimea along this key stretch of coastline. In the initial days of the current conflict, Mariupol had been one of the first sites that Russian forces and their proxies attempted to capture. The Donetsk rebels, mostly using older Russian equipment, advanced from the east. Meanwhile, Russian forces pouring north from Crimea attempted to capture several stronghold cities along the way, including Mariupol, while sending bypass forces around and up the coast to engage Mariupol from the west and put it under siege from both sides. By March 1st, Donetsk People's Republic forces had completed the destruction of nearby Volnovakha, a small town that was completely or almost completely destroyed after being surrounded, and now both the Donetsk rebels and their Russian backers, along with the Russian forces coming from Crimea, put Mariupol under a full-scale siege. Over the next 15 hours, Russian artillery subjected certain Mariupol neighborhoods to continuous shelling. In the continuous 15-hour barrage, hundreds of civilians lost their lives, while the Russians cut off power and water supplies. Russia continued shelling various areas of the city and its suburbs over the next few days. With nighttime temperatures oftentimes falling below the freezing mark, this left over 500,000 people in desperate conditions. Russia offered a temporary ceasefire to set up humanitarian corridors for civilians. However, knowing that Russia has oftentimes shelled or mined so-called humanitarian corridors, Ukrainian civilians did not take the bait. Indeed, all who could not flee the city remained behind alongside the defenders. Speaking of the defenders, Ukraine understood the importance of the city just as much as Russia, and as the cauldron formed, Ukraine began pouring in troops to bolster the pocket. Not only has the Ukrainian army learned a great deal since the disasters of 2014 and 15 at cauldron battles in Ilovaisk and Debaltsevo, but unlike either of those situations where the Ukrainians were completely surrounded, in Mariupol they're only surrounded on 3 sides and still have access to the port from where the Ukrainians can pour in fresh men and materiel. By March 7th, Russia had destroyed the last working cell phone tower in the city, as the civilian humanitarian situation continued to deteriorate under Russian bombardment. On March 9th, the already overflowing cemetery in the city was hit by a Russian shell. The catastrophically high number of bodies now had to be buried in mass graves on the city's outskirts. On March 14th, another temporary humanitarian corridor was set up. One indication that the previous Russian offers were not serious was because the evacuation routes led to Russia, signaling to Ukraine that this was just posturing and that these routes could indeed be mined or ranged by artillery. However, on the 14th and 15th, Russia did legitimately allow several thousand cars to leave the city and head for Ukrainian lines. This came around the same time as Russia's other offensives were stalling out, thus leading some analysts to speculate whether or not the evacuations were related to this wider pause, or whether the Russians would quickly resume their attacks after the evacuation. Nevertheless, now that only those physically incapable of evacuating are remaining in the city among civilians, Russia is expected to even further treat the city as a mere battlefield and launch an all-out artillery assault on the city before attempting to seize it. Such tactics would be reminiscent of those employed by Russia against the city of Grozny in the Second Chechen War, where the entire city was essentially razed to the ground. Now, after capture, Grozny was later rebuilt by the new Russian-backed administration of Chechnya, led by the Kadyrov family. In fact, the Kadyrov administration has sent hardcore Chechen fighters to Mariupol to fight on behalf of the Russian side. Chechens had previously been present on both sides during the 2014 battles for Mariupol. That was the situation at the end of our last video, March 17th. Over subsequent days, the Russians and their Donetsk proxies began to close the noose around Mariupol. On the 18th, the Donetsk People's Republic forces announced that they'd captured the Mariupol airport. On the 20th, reports began to emerge, unconfirmed still, that Russian forces had detained several thousand civilians in captured areas of the city and deported them to Russia. It's also unconfirmed whether they were random or whether those deported to internment camps were on some kind of list prepared by the Russians. Several high-profile Ukrainian targets have apparently been on a list of those for the Russians to kill or capture, including several pro-Ukrainian mayors of captured cities. As of the updated map's published date, the Russians have made inroads on the outskirts of the city. However, the Ukrainian defenders still hold out in a majority of the destroyed cityscape. It's possible that to capture the city, Russia will have to engage in a long, bloody street battle in which the Ukrainians will essentially make them clear out every building room by room. If it continues to develop in this way, it may take months for the Russians to clear the city as it develops into a total meat grinder. If Ukraine can keep its access to the sea open, perhaps the city can even hold out indefinitely. Even if Russia does take the city, they'll have done so at immense cost, with the Ukrainians making them pay a high price for every block and every room cleared. One of the most controversial events of the siege of Mariupol is reflective of a wider trend in the campaign, that being the reported shelling of a maternity ward by Russian artillery. As Russian offensives ground to a halt across the country, frustration seemed to increase, and as mentioned in the last video, a new shock and awe bombing and shelling campaign ensued, in which numerous military and civilian targets were struck in cities across Ukraine, including both west and east. Meanwhile, Putin attempted to hit the reset button by holding a rally in Moscow. At this event on March 18th, Putin announced to a crowd of over 100,000 that the operation was going according to plan, and that there was nothing to worry about. The rally was staged on the 8th anniversary of Crimea's accession to the Russian Federation in 2014, and the theme and title of the event saw Putin doubling down on his nonsensical justification for the war, calling the event the Rally for a World Without Nazism. The fact remains, though, that Russia's offensive has clearly bogged down in all theaters. This occurred for a variety of reasons, with one of the widest cited explanations being that Russia is not prepared for the kind of conflict that it was attempting to stage. In other words, Russia's army is designed for the type of fighting that they're starting to transition to in Mariupol, namely a type of siege tactic where the Russians bypass and surround cities, then pulverize them to dust before occupying them, as seen in Grozny during the Chechen Wars and other past examples. However, the Russian army is not constructed for the type of warfare that was planned in Ukraine, with an initial shock and awe campaign followed by paratrooper landings, seizure of key points, and a lightning blitzkrieg-style ground offensive. This may have been to preserve civilian infrastructure for the purposes of occupying the country. However, it seems Russian frustration has now led to not only a second shock and awe campaign across the board, but also the increased shelling of individual cities the Russians are trying to capture, not just Mariupol, but Kiev and Kharkiv as well, which, while far more destructive than the war Russia was trying to wage, is much more in line with Russian military doctrine. If Russia has to resort to this for every city the way it has in Mariupol, the effect would not only be disastrous for the civilian inhabitants, but also for the Russian army. It will also make the country very difficult to rebuild, especially with so much internal opposition to the Russians, even if such cities are eventually captured by Russia. Furthermore, it'll be very difficult for the Russians, especially if they're still unable to capture Mariupol, to regain the momentum of their ground offensive. Contrary to some reports about the Russians throwing in cannon fodder, Russia's attempt at the initial lightning attack saw them deploy many of their best troops and tanks for the occasion, many of which have now been destroyed. Most of these are professional contracted troops. Now, ever since the wars in Afghanistan and then Chechnya, the latter of which is recognized as Russian territory by the rest of the world, there's been a dogma not to use conscript troops in foreign countries. This also makes practical sense, as contract troops generally fight much better and are more motivated than conscripts. And while there may be some conscripts in Ukraine, the vast majority of the early troops sent in to achieve that initial lightning victory were contract soldiers, some of whom were elite troops including special forces, Spetsnaz, and paratroops. This means that most of the troops and tanks that Russia has yet to send in are generally conscript troops or inferior equipment. The poor quality of its own reinforcements, along with the continuing stiff Ukrainian resistance, are not the only reasons that the Russians may find it difficult to regain the momentum of their advance. That's because the weather is also working against them. Outside of the urban areas that are mostly covered in blacktop, the movement of armies through Central and Eastern Europe essentially becomes impossible during the spring and fall rains when the frozen ground melts and turns to mud, trapping military vehicles and equipment in a cement-like quagmire. This is known as the Rasputitsa and has oftentimes had a negative effect on military campaigns in the region. Even in the smaller scale fighting of the 2014 and 2015 campaigns, the Rasputitsa had a major role, essentially preventing advances by either side throughout the entire autumn of 2014, sandwiched between a Russian summer offensive and a winter offensive. If indeed the current Russian offensive gets bogged down in the Rasputitsa, it may not even matter what the quality of the Russian reinforcement troops or vehicles is. If that ends up being the case and the front lines are stalled for several more months, that would change the entire dynamic of the war. Russia, though, can help its own case if it can win at Mariupol sooner than later and free up divisions to send west and north. Meanwhile, they could also potentially get a boost if Belarusian forces get involved. In recent days, there's been rumors that Belarus will send its 60,000-strong army into the conflict, presumably along the northwestern front. However, longtime Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko has thus far defied Putin's insistence that Belarus throw its troops into the conflict. One reason may be that he's worried about his regime at home, which came under drastic threat in 2020 and is largely propped up by the Russian security forces, as the idea of war against Ukraine is extremely unpopular amongst the Belarusian people, who largely view the Ukrainians as not only a brother East Slavic people, but even closer than that given the long shared history between the Belarusian and Ukrainian people. So we'll keep an eye on that going forward, along with whether new progress is made on the Kiev and Kharkiv campaigns, and whether either side is able to gain an advantage in the ongoing bloody siege of Mariupol. Once again, we've updated the Apolitical World Map through the published date, so check that out on apoliticalworldmap.org, where you'll also see the other changes since our last update reflected. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, comment, donate on Patreon if you can, and thank you very much for watching. We'll continue to follow this conflict, so stay tuned to the channel. For now, I'm Alex, I am out.